For 4 long years, this little boy never said a single word. Not to his father, not to the doctors, not even to himself. Imagine that, a house full of toys, therapists flown in from around the world, every treatment money could buy, and still silence. His billionaire father had everything except the one thing he wanted most, his son's voice. And then one ordinary day, a delivery lady walked through the gates of that mansion, no medical degree, no plan, just a box in her hands, and a heart that carried more than anyone could see. What happened next? Nobody could have imagined. Because sometimes, the people we least expect carry the power to heal the deepest wounds. Jim Morrison stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his mansion, watching the city lights blink like distant stars. From up here, everything looked small, manageable, under control. But control was an illusion he'd been chasing for 4 years now, ever since the day his son Leo was born. 4 years, 48 months, over 1,000 days of silence. The therapist called it selective mutism. The specialists threw around terms like developmental delay and processing disorder. Jim called it his personal hell. He'd built an empire worth $3 billion. He could buy anything, influence anyone, make problems disappear with a phone call. But he couldn't make his son speak. The mansion, because calling it a house would be like calling the ocean a puddle, sprawled across 5 acres of manicured perfection. Glass and steel, sharp angles and cold surfaces that echoed every footstep. It was an architectural marvel that had graced the cover of 3 design magazines. It was also the loneliest place on earth. Jim walked through the halls that evening, his Italian leather shoes clicking against imported marble. Past the grand staircase, past the gallery of abstract art worth millions, past rooms that stayed empty most of the time. The silence pressed against his eardrums like water pressure, making him want to scream just to fill the void. He found Leo in the playroom, surrounded by toys that could stock an entire store. Educational tablets, wooden puzzles from Sweden, hand-carved blocks from Germany. Leo sat in the center of it all, organizing his colored pencils by shade, arranging them in perfect gradients from light to dark. Over and over again. The same pattern, the same ritual. "Hey, buddy," Jim said softly, crouching down to Leo's level. Leo didn't look up. His small hands continued their precise work, placing each pencil exactly where it belonged in his world of order and silence. Jim's chest tightened. He'd read every parenting book, consulted every expert. He knew he was supposed to join Leo's world, not force Leo into his. So he sat down and picked up a pencil, holding it out like an offering. Leo's dark eyes flicked toward the pencil, then away. Not interested. Not today. "That's okay," Jim whispered, setting it down gently. "I'm right here when you're ready." But Leo was never ready. Not for Jim. Not for anyone. The doorbell chimed through the house, a soft, melodic sound that seemed wrong in all this silence. Mrs. Cullen, the housekeeper, would get it. Probably another delivery. Jim ordered everything online now. Groceries, supplies, toys Leo would never play with. Anything to avoid going out into the world where people would stare at his silent son and whisper their judgments. "Mr. Morrison?" Mrs. Cullen's voice carried up the stairs. "There's a delivery that requires your signature." Jim sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Be right there." He gave Leo one more look. His beautiful, mysterious boy with his mother's dark curls and eyes that held galaxies of thoughts he'd never share. Then Jim stood and walked downstairs, preparing to sign whatever form needed signing, tip whoever needed tipping, and return to his vigil of waiting for words that never came. But when he reached the foyer, something shifted. The delivery woman stood just inside the doorway, holding a large box with an ease that suggested she'd been doing this for years. She wore the standard uniform, polo shirt, cargo pants, comfortable shoes. Her hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she had the kind of face that wasn't classically beautiful but held your attention anyway. There was warmth there. Life. Something Jim hadn't seen in his house for a very long time. "Mr. Morrison?" she said, and her voice had a slight rasp to it, like honey poured over gravel. I need your signature for—" She stopped mid-sentence, her eyes fixed on something behind him. Jim turned and felt his heart stop. Leo stood at the bottom of the stairs, his small hand gripping the banister. He never came down when strangers were around. Never. He always hid in his room or behind Mrs. Cullen's legs until the intruders left. But now, he stood there, staring at the delivery woman with an intensity Jim had never seen before. "Hey there," the woman said softly, and something in her voice changed. It became gentler, warmer, like sunlight through honey. She set the box down carefully and crouched to Leo's level, not moving toward him, just making herself smaller, less threatening. Jim wanted to say something, to explain that Leo didn't respond to people, wouldn't answer, shouldn't be forced. But the words stuck in his throat. "You like purple?" the woman asked, noticing the purple pencil still clutched in Leo's hand. "That's my favorite color, too, especially the really dark purple, like grape juice. Or like the sky just before nighttime, you know? Not quite black yet, but getting close." Leo tilted his head, still staring. The woman smiled, and it transformed her whole face. "I bet you know all the shades of purple, don't you? There's lilac and lavender and violet and what's that really fancy one called? Mauve." "Yeah, mauve. That's a purple word that sounds like what it is, soft and gentle." Jim watched, frozen, as Leo took one small step forward. Then another. "My name's Adeline," the woman said, her voice never losing that gentle quality. "But most people just call me Addie. What do you like to be called?" The silence stretched. Jim braced himself for the disappointment he knew was coming. The woman would realize Leo didn't talk, would feel awkward, would leave like everyone else eventually did, with pity in their eyes and relief they didn't have to deal with it. But Adeline didn't look away. She didn't force it or push or get that panicky look people got when children didn't respond. She just smiled and said, "You know what? Sometimes the best conversations happen without words. My grandma always said, your eyes tell me everything I need to know, and you've got storytelling eyes." Leo took another step closer. Jim's breath caught. His son was now only 3 feet from a complete stranger, closer than he'd been to anyone outside the household in months. "That's my tablet," Adeline said, nodding toward the device on her belt. "I use it for work, tracking packages and stuff. Pretty boring, really. But I bet the games on your tablet are way cooler. Do you have the one with the dinosaurs? My nephew loves that one. He makes all the roaring sounds." She made a gentle, small roar, nothing loud or startling. "Though between you and me, I don't think real dinosaurs sounded exactly like that." And then Jim would swear on everything he owned that he saw it. Leo's lips twitched, almost a smile, the ghost of something that might become joy if given permission. "Adeline Rees?" Jim said, his voice coming out rougher than intended. "That's you?" She stood, breaking the moment, and turned to him with a professional smile that was cooler than the one she'd given Leo. "Yes, sir. I just need your signature here." She held out the tablet. Jim signed without looking at it, his mind racing. "You're good with kids." "I used to work with them," she said simply, taking the tablet back. "Special needs, mostly." Before life got complicated. There was a story there, buried under those casual words. Pain, maybe. Loss. Jim recognized it because he carried his own version of it. The ghost of his late wife, the mother Leo would never remember. How much would it take? The words came out before Jim had fully thought them through. Adeline blinked. "I'm sorry? To hire you, privately, for 3 months. Jim's business mind kicked into gear, calculating, strategizing. "You said you worked with special needs kids. My son Leo, he doesn't speak, hasn't said a word since birth. I've had 17 therapists, specialists from 3 countries, spent over $2 million trying to reach him, and in 5 minutes you got him to almost smile." Adeline's expression shifted, something defensive rising in her eyes. "Mr. Morrison, I'm not a therapist. I deliver packages. I'll pay you $50,000 a month." Her mouth opened, then closed. "That's more than you make in a year doing this," Jim pressed, gesturing at her uniform. Live here. Work with Leo. No specific requirements except spending time with him. If he makes progress, continues to respond to you the way he just did, I'll double it at the end. If it doesn't work, you still walk away with $150,000 for 3 months of work. This is crazy, Adeline said, but he could see her mind working, weighing options, calculating her own desperate mathematics. Is it? Jim stepped closer, and he could smell something like vanilla and cardboard boxes, ordinary and real. You're clearly overqualified for package delivery. Something happened that put you there. Maybe something that money could help fix. Maybe something that a second chance could heal. Her jaw tightened. You don't know anything about me. No, Jim agreed, but my son responded to you. That's all I need to know. Adeline looked past him to where Leo still stood, watching them with those huge, soulful eyes. Jim saw something flicker across her face. Longing, maybe. Or recognition. The way you look at something precious you'd lost and found again in an unexpected place. 3 months, she said finally. And I don't do manipulation or punishment-based methods. I don't force progress or push milestones. If Leo needs silence, he gets silence. If he needs space, he gets space. Agreed. And if your parenting is the problem, I'm going to tell you. Jim's jaw clenched. Nobody talked to him like that. He had board members who trembled before him, competitors who lost sleep over his strategies. Agreed. Then I need to think about it. 48 hours, Jim said. After that, the offer expires. Adeline nodded once, picked up her scanner, and headed for the door. But before she left, she turned back to Leo and gave him that warm smile again. It was really nice to meet you. I hope I see you again soon. And then she did something that stopped Jim's heart for the second time that evening. She winked at Leo and whispered, just loud enough for him to hear, "Purple's still the best color, though. Don't let anyone tell you different." Leo's hand moved to his chest, resting there like he was trying to hold something in or keep something safe. His lips parted, and for one impossible, breathless moment, Jim thought he might speak. Instead, Leo lifted his hand in a small wave. A wave. His son, who'd never acknowledged a stranger's departure in his entire life, waved goodbye. The door closed behind Adeline Reese with a soft click that echoed through the mansion like a gunshot. Jim stood in the foyer, his heart pounding, his mind reeling. After 4 years of silence, $3 million in treatments, and 17 failed attempts at connection, a delivery woman had just walked through his door and shifted something fundamental in his son's world. He looked at Leo, who was still staring at the closed door, still holding his hand against his chest like he was protecting a secret. "Buddy," Jim said softly. "Did you like her?" Leo didn't answer. Of course he didn't. But he also didn't walk away. He stood there in the foyer, in a space he usually avoided, looking at the door like he was willing it to open again. And for the first time in 4 years, Jim Morrison felt something that terrified him more than the silence ever had. Hope. 47 hours later, Jim's phone rang with an unknown number. "I'll do it." Adeline's voice came through, steady but tinged with something he couldn't quite name. "But I have conditions beyond what we discussed." "Name them." "I keep my apartment. I go there on weekends. This is a job, Mr. Morrison, not a life sentence." "Done." "And you have to be present. Not just in the house, but present. With Leo." "This doesn't work if I'm a substitute for you." Jim's grip tightened on the phone. "I'm present." "Are you?" Her challenge was soft but unmistakable. "Because that mansion is beautiful and that boy is lonely, and those two things are connected." "You're not a therapist, remember? You said so yourself." "No," Adeline agreed. "But I know what absence looks like in a child's eyes, and I saw it in Leo's, even when you were standing right next to him." The words made him furious. Jim wanted to argue, to defend himself with all the hours he'd spent trying to reach Leo, all the effort he'd poured into finding solutions. But something in him recognized the truth. "When can you start?" he asked instead. "Monday. I need 3 days to wrap things up at work. I'll have a contract drawn up. You'll sign it Monday morning, and we'll—" "Mr. Morrison," Adeline interrupted. "If we're going to do this, let's be clear about something from the start. I'm not intimidated by contracts or lawyers or money. I'm doing this for Leo. Only Leo. So save your business tactics for your boardroom, because they won't work on me." She hung up before he could respond. Jim stared at his phone, torn between irritation and something that felt dangerously like admiration. In his world, people didn't hang up on him. They didn't challenge him or set boundaries or refuse to be impressed by his power. He looked across his office to where Leo sat in the corner, playing with his pencils again, arranging them in their color-coded order. His son's small face was serious, focused, lost, in a world Jim couldn't enter no matter how much money he spent trying to find the door. But maybe, just maybe, Adeline Rees had found a window. Jim walked over and sat down next to Leo, not touching, not speaking, just being there, present, like she'd said. The pencils clicked softly as Leo worked, and the silence between them felt less like a wall and more like a shared space. Fragile but real. "She's coming back, buddy," Jim whispered. "The lady with the purple. She's coming back." Leo's hands paused for just a fraction of a second before continuing their careful work. But Jim saw it. The pause. The acknowledgement. And, in the vast silence of his mansion, with his son beside him and hope cracking through his chest like spring ice breaking apart, Jim Morrison allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, everything was about to change. The pencils clicked. The city lights blinked beyond the windows. And somewhere in the spaces between the silence, something new was beginning to grow. Something that sounded a lot like possibility. Monday morning arrived with the kind of rain that makes everything look softer, gentler, like the world is apologizing for being too harsh. Jim had been up since 5, which wasn't unusual. He rarely slept more than 4 hours. But this morning, the restlessness felt different, anticipatory, almost nervous. He stood in the foyer with Leo, waiting. Mrs. Cullen had prepared a guest room on the second floor, the one with morning light and a view of the garden. The contract sat on his desk, pristine and detailed, covering every legal contingency his lawyers could imagine, except the one that mattered. What if this actually worked? Leo pressed against Jim's leg, which was unusual. His son typically maintained careful distance from everyone, a bubble of personal space that seemed measured by some internal calculator. But this morning, he stood close, his small hand gripping the edge of Jim's suit jacket. "She'll be here soon," Jim said softly. The doorbell rang, and Leo jumped. Not in fear, but in something that looked like excitement. Jim had forgotten what that looked like on his son's face. When he opened the door, Adeline stood there with a duffel bag over her shoulder and rain speckling her jacket. She'd pulled her hair back again, practical and no nonsense, but there was something different about her in casual clothes. More real somehow, less uniform, more person. "Mr. Morrison," she said with a nod. "Jim," he corrected. "If you're going to live here, you might as well use my first name, Jim." She agreed, but her tone suggested she was humoring him more than accepting invitation to familiarity. Then she looked down and saw Leo, and her whole face transformed. "Hey there, Purple Master. Remember me?" Leo didn't step forward, but he didn't hide either. He stood there, still gripping Jim's jacket, looking at Adeline with those deep, thoughtful eyes. "I brought something for you," Adeline said, setting her bag down and crouching. She pulled out a small sketchbook with a purple cover. "I thought maybe we could draw together sometime. Nothing fancy, just colors and shapes and whatever feels right. Would you like that?" She didn't hand it to him, didn't push it into his space. She just held it out like an offering, like a bridge waiting to see if anyone would cross. And Leo, impossible, miraculous Leo, let go of Jim's jacket and took one step forward. Jim held his breath. Leo took another step, then reached out with both hands and took the sketchbook. He held it against his chest the same way he'd held his hand 2 days ago, like something precious he needed to protect. "That's yours now," Adeline said gently. "You don't have to show me what you draw unless you want to. Sometimes art is just for us, right? Just for our own hearts." Leo nodded. Jim's knees nearly gave out. A nod. A clear, unmistakable nod. Acknowledgement. Communication. Connection. Adeline stood and finally looked at Jim, and he must have looked as shell-shocked as he felt because her expression softened slightly. Let's get started then. The first week was a dance of careful boundaries and tentative trust. Adeline refused to be intimidated by the mansion's scale or luxury. While Jim's previous hires had tiptoed around, speaking in hushed voices and treating everything like it might break, Adeline moved through the space like she belonged anywhere she decided to be. She opened curtains Jim had kept closed for years, letting light flood into rooms that had forgotten what warmth looked like. She kicked off her shoes at the door and walked in socks, telling Jim that mansions were for living in, not museums for tiptoeing through. "This place is beautiful," she said on the second day, standing in the cathedral-like living room with its 20-foot ceilings. "But it feels like a hotel. Where's the life?" Jim bristled. "This is a $300 million architectural." "I didn't ask about the price tag," Adeline interrupted. "I asked about the life. Where are the family photos? The messy corners? The proof that people actually exist here?" "We exist here. Do you?" She looked at him with those eyes that saw too much. "Or do you just occupy space here?" "There's a difference." Jim wanted to argue, but he couldn't. Because she was right. After Maria died, he'd erased every trace of mess and humanity, thinking that control and order would somehow fill the void. Instead, he just created a bigger emptiness. That afternoon, Adeline and Leo spread art supplies across the pristine white coffee table in the living room. Paint, markers, that purple sketchbook. Leo drew loops and spirals, careful patterns that probably meant something in his internal language. Adeline sat beside him, not directing or correcting, just drawing her own swirls and shapes. "You know what I see when I look at your drawings," she said softly. "I see music. Like each line is a note, and together they make a song only you can hear." Leo paused, looked at her, then very deliberately drew a long, swooping line that curved across the page like a wave. "Beautiful," Adeline whispered. "That's a whole symphony right there." Jim watched from the doorway, afraid to enter and break whatever magic was happening. His son was engaging, creating, almost happy. And he was doing it with a woman who'd been in their lives for 48 hours. Jealousy flickered in Jim's chest, hot and unwelcome. He was the father. He'd been trying for 4 years. Why her? What did she have that he didn't? That evening, after Leo was asleep, Jim found Adeline in the kitchen making tea. She'd found the honey he didn't know they had, and she moved through the space like she'd been there for months instead of days. "He responded to you again today," Jim said, trying to keep his voice neutral. "He responded to his own creativity," Adeline corrected, not looking up from her tea. "I was just there to witness it." "Still, you're doing something right." "I'm doing something different," she said, finally turning to face him. "There's a difference between right and different." "Enlighten me." Adeline leaned against the counter, studying him with an expression that made Jim feel transparent. "Your son doesn't need another therapist treating him like a problem to solve. He needs someone who sees him as complete exactly as he is." "The silence isn't a defect, Jim. It's his current language. Maybe instead of trying to make him speak ours, we should learn to speak his." "That's not how the world works." "No," Adeline agreed. "That's not how your world works." "But Leo's world? It's gentler than that. It's softer. And maybe that's not the problem you think it is." Jim's jaw clenched. "You've been here 2 days and you're already criticizing my parenting?" "I told you I would if I needed to. Are you already regretting hiring someone who tells you the truth?" They stared at each other across the kitchen, tension crackling like static electricity. Adeline didn't back down, didn't soften her gaze or apologize. She just stood there, steady and immovable, like a tree that had weathered too many storms to be frightened by one more. "He's happy with you," Jim said finally, and he heard the defeat in his own voice. "That's what matters." Something flickered across Adeline's face. Sympathy, maybe, or understanding. "He could be happy with you too, if you let yourself be imperfect around him." "I don't do imperfect." "I know," Adeline said softly, "and that's exactly the problem." The second week brought breakthroughs that felt like small miracles. Leo laughed. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon. Adeline was acting out a story with stuffed animals, something silly about a penguin who wanted to be a flamingo, and she made the penguin do an awkward waddle dance. The sound that came from Leo's mouth was rusty, like something that hadn't been used in so long it had forgotten how to work properly. But it was laughter. Real, genuine, joyful laughter. Jim was in his office on a conference call when he heard it. He hung up on a senator mid-sentence and ran toward the sound like it was a lifeline. He found them in Leo's playroom, Adeline holding up the penguin, Leo with his hands over his mouth but his whole body shaking with giggles. "Again!" Adeline said, making the penguin waddle even more dramatically. Leo laughed harder, the sound growing stronger, more confident. And Jim just stood there, watching his son experience joy, feeling his heart crack open in ways he hadn't known were possible. But the laughter wasn't for him. That was the painful truth that sat like a stone in his chest. Leo laughed for Adeline. He smiled at Adeline. He reached for Adeline when he needed comfort or wanted to share something. And Jim? Jim was still just the man who stood in doorways, watching his son's life happen with someone else. That night, after Leo was asleep, Jim found himself walking past Adeline's room. The door was cracked open, and he could see her sitting on the bed with her phone, her face illuminated by the screen's glow. She looked sad, deeply, bone-achingly sad, the kind of sadness that lives in your marrow and colors everything you touch. He knocked softly. Adeline looked up, quickly wiping her eyes. "Yeah?" "I heard him laugh today," Jim said, not entering, just standing at the threshold. "I wanted to thank you." "You don't need to thank me for letting a child be happy." "Still, Jim paused, the words feeling clumsy in his mouth. "I don't remember the last time I heard him laugh. I don't think he ever has." "Not like that." Adeline's expression softened. "He's been waiting for permission to be himself. Sometimes all children need is someone who doesn't expect them to be anything other than what they already are." "Is that what you do? Not expect anything?" "I expect him to be Leo," Adeline said. "Nothing more, nothing less, whatever that means in this moment." Jim wanted to ask more, about her sadness, about her past, about what made her understand his son better than he did. But Adeline's walls were up now, her professional distance reasserting itself like armor. "Good night, Jim," she said, a clear dismissal. "Good night." He walked away, feeling more alone than ever, which made no sense because his house had one more person in it than it had 2 weeks ago. But somehow, Adeline's presence made his isolation more obvious, like a lamp illuminating just how much dust had settled on his life. By the 3rd week, Leo's progress was undeniable. He made eye contact more frequently. He responded to simple questions with nods or shakes of his head. He even started bringing Adeline things, a toy, a book, the purple sketchbook, wanting to share his world with her. Jim watched it all from the sidelines, trying to be present like Adeline had demanded, but feeling like an intruder in his own son's life. One evening, Jim tried to join them during drawing time. He sat down at the coffee table with his own paper, picked up a marker, and tried to draw. Leo immediately stopped, his small body tensing. "It's okay," Adeline said gently to Leo. "Your dad wants to create with us too." But Leo shook his head, gathered his materials, and moved to the other side of the room. Jim's heart shattered into something too small to name. "He's not ready," Adeline said softly, seeing Jim's face. "He's never ready, not for me." "That's not true, isn't it?" Jim threw the marker down, not caring that it rolled across the expensive rug. "He laughs for you. He shares with you. He exists around you. And me? I'm just furniture. Part of the mansion he tolerates." "Jim?" "No." He stood, needing to move, needing to escape the weight of his own failure. "You're doing exactly what I hired you to do." Leo's responding, making progress. "That's all that matters." "Is it?" Jim turned to face her, and the understanding in her eyes was almost cruel in its clarity. She saw him. Really saw him. Saw the loneliness, the inadequacy, the desperate love that had nowhere to go. "Your son doesn't need your money," Adeline said, her voice gentle but unyielding. He needs your heart, your real heart, not the controlled, perfected version you show the world. The messy, scared, imperfect heart that makes mistakes and admits to being lost. I don't know how to do that. I know, Adeline said, but you need to figure it out, because I'm not going to be here forever, and when I leave, Leo's going to need you. The real you. Her words hung in the air like smoke, impossible to ignore. That night, Jim stood in Leo's doorway, watching his son sleep. Leo clutched the purple sketchbook against his chest, even in dreams. His face was peaceful in a way Jim rarely saw during waking hours. I don't know how to reach you, Jim whispered to the sleeping child. I don't know what I'm doing wrong, but I love you. God, I love you so much it terrifies me. Leo shifted in his sleep, murmuring something too soft to hear, and Jim felt his control crumbling. All his careful walls developing cracks that let in light and pain in equal measure. He'd spent 4 years trying to fix Leo, trying to solve the silence like it was a business problem that could be overcome with enough resources and strategy. But maybe Adeline was right. Maybe Leo wasn't the one who needed fixing. The explosion came on Friday of the 3rd week. Jim came home early from work, another thing he'd been doing more often since Adeline arrived, and found them in the living room. Leo was asleep, curled up on the couch with his head in Adeline's lap. She was reading a book, one hand resting protectively on Leo's shoulder, and she was humming something soft and sweet. The scene was perfect, domestic, like a photograph of a family that wasn't his. Something hot and poisonous flooded Jim's chest. Jealousy, yes, but also something darker. Fear. Because Leo looked peaceful in a way he never did with Jim. Content. Safe. He fell asleep about 20 minutes ago, Adeline said softly, looking up from her book. We were playing, and he just curled up next to me and... Enough, Jim said, his voice harder than he intended. Adeline blinked. What? This. All of this. Jim gestured at the scene, at his sleeping son, at the woman who'd somehow become more important to Leo than he was. You're getting too close, too attached. Jim, that's the point. Connection with boundaries. Jim snapped. Not whatever this is. You're not his mother, Adeline. You're an employee. The words hit like slaps. Jim saw them land, saw Adeline's face go carefully blank in that way people do when they're protecting themselves from pain. You're right, she said quietly. I'm not his mother. But you might want to ask yourself why a stranger is better at giving him what he needs than his own father. Get out, Jim, out of this room, now. His voice was ice, the CEO voice that made grown men nervous. I'll put Leo to bed. You've done enough damage for today. Adeline stood carefully, sliding out from under Leo without waking him. She looked at Jim with something that might have been pity or might have been disappointment. You're scared, she said. That's okay. Being a parent is terrifying, but pushing away everyone who loves him isn't going to make you feel less alone. It's just going to make sure you actually are. She walked out, leaving Jim with his sleeping son and the wreckage of his own cruelty. Jim carefully lifted Leo, carrying him upstairs to his room. Leo stirred, reaching out, murmuring something that sounded like Addie. Not Dad. Not Daddy. Addie. Jim tucked Leo into bed, pulling the covers up with hands that shook slightly. His son, his beautiful boy, was slipping away from him. Or maybe the truth was worse. Leo had never been his to begin with, and he'd just been too busy trying to fix him to notice. I'm sorry, Jim whispered into the darkness. I don't know how to be what you need. I don't know how to be enough. Leo slept on, peaceful and unreachable. And Jim sat there beside the bed, watching his son breathe, feeling his own heart break into pieces so small he wasn't sure they could ever be put back together. The weekend passed in careful silence. Adeline went to her apartment as planned, leaving behind a house that felt emptier than before she'd arrived. Leo spent Saturday looking for her, checking rooms, standing by the front door with hope, dying gradually in his eyes. Jim tried. God, he tried. He sat with Leo, offered to draw with him, even attempted to recreate one of Adeline's silly puppet shows. But everything felt forced, performative, like acting in a play where he didn't know the lines. By Sunday evening, Leo had retreated back into himself, the small progress evaporating like morning dew. No laughs, no nods, just silence and those watchful eyes that seemed to ask, "Where is she?" When Adeline's car pulled up Monday morning, Leo was pressed against the window, waiting. The moment she walked through the door, he ran to her, actually ran, and threw his arms around her legs. Jim watched from the stairs, invisible again. "I missed you too," Adeline said softly, crouching to Leo's level. "Did you have a good weekend?" Leo shook his head, then buried his face against her shoulder. Something in Jim's chest crumbled a little more. That afternoon, while Leo napped, Adeline found Jim in his office. She knocked once, then entered without waiting for permission, and Jim recognized it as a power move. She was staking claim to space, refusing to be dismissed or controlled. "We need to talk," she said, closing the door behind her. "About your insubordination? Your complete disregard for professional boundaries?" Jim didn't look up from his computer, even though he hadn't actually read a word on the screen in the past hour. "About your fear," Adeline said simply. That got his attention. He looked up, ready to deliver a cutting remark, but the expression on her face stopped him. It wasn't judgment or pity. It was understanding, the kind that comes from personal experience with pain. "I'm not afraid," Jim said, but the words sounded weak even to his own ears. "You're terrified," Adeline countered. She walked to the window, looking out at the manicured grounds. "I've been watching you, Jim. The way you hover in doorways but won't come in. The way you reach for Leo but pull back before actually touching him. You're so afraid of doing it wrong that you're not doing anything at all." "That's not." "It is." She turned to face him. "And I get it. I really do. Loving someone is the most vulnerable thing we can do. Loving a child who can't tell you they love you back, that's even harder. But pushing everyone away isn't protection, Jim. It's just another kind of prison." Jim stood, needing to move, to escape her gaze that saw too much. He walked to the bar cart in the corner, poured himself a scotch even though it was barely 2 in the afternoon. "What do you want me to say? That I'm a failure as a father? That I've spent 4 years trying to connect with my own son and gotten nowhere? That watching him light up for you makes me feel like I'm dying inside?" "Yes," Adeline said softly. "Say all of that, out loud, to Leo, to yourself. Stop pretending you have everything under control when you're clearly falling apart." Jim laughed, bitter and sharp. "You think vulnerability is going to make my mute son suddenly want to bond with me? That's not how the world works." "No, it's how love works. And there's a difference." The scotch burned going down, but not enough to cauterize the wound Adeline's words had opened. Jim set the glass down harder than necessary. "You don't know anything about my relationship with my son. I know he's scared of disappointing you," Adeline said, and her voice was so gentle it hurt worse than if she'd yelled. "I know he sees how perfect everything in this house is, how controlled and pristine, and he's terrified that he doesn't fit, that his silence is just another flaw in a world that demands perfection." "That's not. I've never made him feel." "You don't have to say it out loud for him to feel it, Jim. Children sense things. They read emotions in the spaces between words, in the way you hold your shoulders, in the sighs you don't think anyone hears." Adeline stepped closer, her eyes searching his face. "When's the last time you told Leo it was okay to be exactly who he is? Not who you hope he'll become, not the speaking, social version you're trying to create. Just him. Just Leo. Silence and all." Jim's throat tightened. "Every day. I tell him every day that I love him." "That's not what I asked." The silence stretched between them, heavy with truth neither wanted to fully acknowledge. "I don't know how to fail," Jim said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "My entire life, every success, everything I've built, it's because I don't accept failure. I find solutions. I overcome obstacles. But with Leo..." He paused, the admission scraping its way up his throat like glass. With Leo, nothing works. And I don't know how to exist in a space where trying harder doesn't equal results. Adeline's expression softened. Maybe that's the lesson. Maybe Leo isn't an obstacle to overcome. Maybe he's a teacher showing you that love isn't transactional. It's not about input and output, effort and results. It's just being. Together, imperfect and present. I'm not good at being imperfect. I know, Adeline said, but your son needs you to try. Because right now, you're so busy being the perfect provider that you've forgotten to be his dad. Jim sank into his desk chair, suddenly exhausted in a way that went deeper than physical tiredness. What if I can't? What if I'm too broken to give him what he needs? Then you start by admitting you're broken, Adeline said. And you let Leo see that it's okay. That being broken doesn't make you less. It makes you human. She moved toward the door, then paused. I need to tell you something about why I really took this job. Jim looked up, seeing something shift in her posture. Walls coming down, armor cracking. 5 years ago, Adeline said, not looking at him, I was a pediatric specialist. I worked with nonverbal children, kids on the spectrum, trauma survivors. I was good at it. Really good. I had a fiancé, David. We were planning our wedding. I was pregnant. Her voice caught, just slightly, but she pushed through. David worked in corporate safety inspection. He was contracted by a huge tech company to evaluate their manufacturing facility. He found violations, serious ones, unsafe conditions, corner cutting that put workers at risk. He filed a report, pushed for immediate corrections. Jim felt ice forming in his veins. He knew where this was going. The company ignored the recommendations. Too expensive to fix, they said, bad for quarterly earnings. 3 weeks later, there was an explosion. Chemical leak combined with faulty ventilation. 6 workers died. Adeline's hands were shaking now. David was there doing a follow-up inspection. He got workers out, went back for more. The second explosion. She stopped, swallowed hard. They said he didn't suffer. That's what they tell you when there's not enough left to be sure. Adeline, I lost the baby 2 days later. Stress, trauma, grief. Doctors couldn't say exactly why. Just that sometimes a body shuts down when the heart breaks too completely. She finally turned to look at him, and her eyes were dry but haunted. I couldn't work with children anymore after that. Every kid I saw was the one I'd lost. Every small victory felt like a betrayal of the future I'd never have. So I quit, took the first mindless job I could find. Delivering packages seemed appropriately empty. Jim stood, not sure what to say, what to offer. The company, the one that ignored David's report. What was it? Adeline met his eyes steadily. Morrison Tech Industries. Your company, Jim. Your oversight. Your quarterly earnings. Your decision to prioritize profit over people. So when I say I understand what it's like to be broken, I mean it. And when I say Leo needs you to be real with him, I'm not speaking theoretically. I'm speaking from experience of what happens when the people with power choose everything except what actually matters. Jim felt his knees weaken, his carefully constructed world tilting sideways. I remember that incident. The factory in Ohio. We paid settlements, put new protocols in place. You paid money, Adeline corrected, to make it go away, to protect the stock price. But you never admitted fault, never acknowledged that David died because your company valued efficiency over human life. I didn't know. I wasn't personally involved in... You're the CEO, Adeline said, her voice hard now. Everything is your responsibility. That's what you tell your board, isn't it? That you're accountable for every decision, every outcome? Jim had no answer. Because she was right. He'd built an empire on the principle of absolute control, absolute authority, which meant the failures were his too, even when he hadn't personally made the decision that led to tragedy. Why did you take this job? Jim asked hoarsely. If you hate me, if you blame me for everything you lost, why come here? Why help my son? Adeline was quiet for a long moment, because Leo didn't make those decisions. He's innocent, and maybe... Her voice softened, cracked slightly. Maybe helping him is the only way I can forgive myself for not being able to save my own child. Maybe this is my redemption for all the ways I've been too broken to function." "You're not broken," Jim said. "You're surviving." "So are you," Adeline replied. "We're both just doing it badly." The admission hung between them, a bridge made of shared damage. "I should quit," Adeline said finally. "This was a mistake. I can't separate my feelings about what your company did from who you are. And Leo deserves better than someone who's using him to heal her own wounds. Don't." The word came out more forceful than Jim intended. "Don't leave him. Whatever you think of me, whatever I deserve, he needs you. I can see that now. And I'm asking you to stay. Not as an employee, as someone who cares about him. Please." Adeline studied him, and Jim felt stripped bare under that gaze. "If I stay, things change. You don't get to hide behind your office door in your business calls. You show up, really show up, for Leo and for your own healing." "Agreed." "And you start acknowledging that your company's decisions have consequences. Real people, real lives. You can't buy your way out of that guilt, Jim. You have to actually do the work of making things right." The words were a challenge, a test. Jim knew he could fire her right now, end this conversation, go back to his controlled existence where nobody questioned his authority or made him face uncomfortable truths. But he also knew that if he did, he'd lose the only person who'd managed to reach his son, the only person who'd made Leo laugh, the only person who saw through Jim's armor and demanded better. "I'll do the work," Jim said quietly. "I'll try. I can't promise I'll be good at it, but I'll try." Adeline nodded once. That's all anyone can do. She left him standing in his office, surrounded by awards and accolades and evidence of his success, feeling more like a failure than he ever had in his life. That evening, Jim did something he hadn't done in years. He sat on the floor of Leo's playroom and just existed there. No agenda, no goal, no plan to force connection. He just sat with his back against the wall, watching his son organize blocks by size and color. Leo glanced at him occasionally, wary but curious. "I'm not good at this," Jim said after a while. "Being still, being quiet. My brain always wants to be fixing something, solving something. But Adeline says you don't need fixing, that you're already complete exactly as you are." Leo's hands paused on a red block. "I think she's right," Jim continued, his voice rough with emotion he didn't know how to process. "I think I've been so focused on making you speak that I forgot to listen to what you're already saying. Through your drawings, your careful ways. The things you notice that I miss." Leo set the red block down, then picked up a blue one. He held it up, showing it to Jim. "Blue," Jim said softly. "That's a good one. Calming. Like the ocean, or the sky when everything's peaceful." Leo nodded, small, tentative, but real, and Jim felt tears burn behind his eyes. "I love you, buddy. I know I'm not good at showing it the way you need me to, but I'm going to try. I'm going to make mistakes and probably mess up a lot, but I'm here, I'm staying, and I'm going to figure out how to be the dad you deserve." Leo didn't respond with words. He didn't leap into Jim's arms or suddenly transform into the social speaking child Jim had once desperately wanted. But he did something better. He stood up, walked over, and placed the blue block in Jim's hand. Then he went back to his spot and continued playing, occasionally glancing over to make sure Jim was still there. It wasn't a dramatic breakthrough. It wasn't the kind of progress that made headlines or impressed specialists. But it was connection. Real, fragile, precious connection. And for the first time in 4 years, Jim felt like he might actually know his son. Later that night, Jim found Adeline in the kitchen again. She was making that same honey tea, her movements slow and tired like she was carrying weight that went beyond physical exhaustion. "Thank you," Jim said from the doorway. She looked up, surprised. "For what?" "For telling me the truth. About David, about yourself, about me." Jim stepped into the kitchen, maintaining respectful distance. "I'm sorry. For what my company did. For the shortcuts that cost you everything. I can't change the past, but I can. I don't want your money. Adeline interrupted. "I don't want corporate sympathy or a bigger settlement. What I want is for people like you to remember that every decision you make affects real human lives. That efficiency and profit margins have faces and names and futures that get erased when you choose wrong." "I know," Jim said. "And you're right. I've been insulated from the consequences of my decisions for too long. I need to do better." Adeline stirred her tea slowly, considering. David used to say that the measure of a person wasn't what they did when it was easy or profitable. It was what they did when being good was hard and expensive. When integrity cost something real. "He sounds like he was remarkable." "He was," Adeline said, and her voice carried love that death hadn't diminished. "He saw the best in people, even when they didn't deserve it. He would have liked you, I think, if you ever became the person you could be instead of the person you've chosen to be." The words should have stung, but Jim heard them for what they were: an invitation, a challenge, a belief that change was possible if he was willing to do the difficult work. "I sat with Leo tonight," Jim said, "on the floor, just being there. He shared a block with me." Adeline's expression softened. "That's how it starts. Small moments, tiny bridges. Before you know it, you've built something real." "Will you teach me?" Jim asked, and the vulnerability in his own voice startled him. How to be present with him. How to speak his language. "I can try," Adeline said. "But mostly, you just have to show up and pay attention. Leo will teach you if you're willing to learn." They stood in the kitchen, two broken people trying to heal a broken child, and something shifted. Not attraction, not yet, maybe not ever, but understanding. Recognition. The way survivors of the same storm recognize each other even years later. "I'm glad you stayed," Jim said. "I'm not sure I'm glad yet," Adeline admitted, "but I'm here. For Leo. And maybe that's enough for now." Jim nodded and left her to her tea and her ghosts. He climbed the stairs to check on Leo one more time before bed. His son slept peacefully, the blue block tucked beside his purple sketchbook, two treasures that meant everything and nothing. And Jim made a promise in the darkness. He would do better. Be better. Not for redemption or forgiveness or absolution from guilt, but because his son deserved a father who was brave enough to be imperfect, vulnerable, and real, even if it broke him completely in the process. The next 2 weeks brought a fragile new rhythm to the mansion. Jim started joining Leo and Adeline for small activities. Art time, walks in the garden, quiet moments where they existed together without pressure or agenda. Leo's progress remained slow but steady. More eye contact, more nods, occasional smiles that lit up his whole face. And then, on a Tuesday morning that started like any other, everything changed. Adeline was reading to Leo, curled up together on the living room couch. Jim was nearby, responding to emails but mostly just being present like he'd promised. Leo was relaxed against Adeline's side, his small hand playing with the edge of her sleeve, a comfort gesture he'd developed over recent days. "And the little bear finally found his way home," Adeline read, her voice soft and warm. "Where his mama was waiting with honey and hugs and all the love in the world." Leo shifted, looking up at her with those deep, soulful eyes. And then, so quietly, Jim almost missed it. "Mama." The single word dropped into the silence, like a stone into still water, ripples spreading outward in waves that would reshape everything. Adeline froze, her whole body going rigid. Jim's phone slipped from his hands, clattering against the marble floor. "Mama," Leo said again, clearer this time, his small hand gripping Adeline's sleeve tighter. "Mama, stay." Jim couldn't breathe, couldn't think. His son's first words, the moment he'd dreamed about for 4 years, prayed for, spent millions trying to create, and they weren't for him. They were for her. "Leo, sweetie." Adeline's voice was shaking, tears streaming down her face. "I'm not your mama, right? I'm Addie, just Addie." But Leo shook his head, insistent. "Mama, my mama." And Jim watched his son's entire face transform with the act of speaking, like a door had finally opened inside him and light was pouring through. 4 years of silence. Broken. Shattered. Gone. For her. "Congratulations," Jim heard himself say, his voice coming from somewhere far away. "You did it. You got him to speak." Adeline looked at him, and the devastation in her eyes matched what he felt tearing through his chest. "Jim, I didn't. This isn't." "You succeeded," Jim continued, standing up on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. "That's what we hired you for, right?" To reach him. Mission accomplished. "Jim, I need some air." He walked toward his office, each step feeling like wading through concrete. Behind him, he heard Leo's voice again. "Mama sad? Why Mama sad?" Jim closed his office door and stood there in the silence that had defined his life for 4 years. Except now the silence was different. Now it wasn't his son's limitation, but his own failure, echoing in the emptiness. His son had spoken, had chosen language, had broken through the barrier that separated him from the world. Just not for Jim. Never for Jim. He sank into his desk chair and put his head in his hands, and for the first time since Maria died, Jim Morrison let himself cry. Not the careful, controlled tears he'd allowed at her funeral, but deep, wrenching sobs that came from a place he'd kept locked and buried for years. He'd failed. Completely. Utterly. His own son had chosen someone else as his mother figure, had given his first words to a woman who'd been in their lives for barely 6 weeks. What did that say about him? About his parenting? About everything he'd tried to be and do? A soft knock on the door. "Go away," Jim said, not bothering to hide the tears in his voice. But the door opened anyway, and Adeline slipped inside, closing it behind her. Her face was blotchy from crying, her eyes red-rimmed. "I'm so sorry," she said. "I never meant for—" "It's fine," Jim wiped his face roughly. "You did your job, better than anyone could have expected." "The breakthrough is—" "Don't," Adeline interrupted, her voice sharp. "Don't do that corporate detachment thing. Don't pretend this doesn't hurt. What do you want me to say?" Jim looked up at her, not caring that she could see him broken. "That I'm devastated my son's first word was calling someone else his mother? That I've spent 4 years trying everything, being everything, and it still wasn't enough? That watching him choose you makes me feel like I'm being carved out from the inside?" "Yes," Adeline said, moving closer. "Say all of that. Feel all of that. It's real and it's valid and it matters. It doesn't change anything. It changes everything." Adeline sat down across from him, leaning forward. "Jim, Leo didn't call me Mama because he doesn't love you. He called me that because I'm safe to him. I don't have expectations. I'm not tied to all his fears about disappointing you or not being enough. That's supposed to make me feel better? No, it's supposed to make you understand. Leo's first words weren't a rejection of you. They were his way of saying he finally feels secure enough to speak. And you created that security by showing up these past weeks, by being present and imperfect and real." Jim wanted to believe her, God. He wanted to believe that this shattering moment was somehow progress, somehow proof of his growth as a father. But all he could see was his son's face saying Mama to someone else. "I can't do this right now," Jim said, standing up. I need to be alone." "Jim, please," his voice cracked. "Just please." Adeline stood slowly, her expression conflicted. "I'm going to my apartment for a few days. Give you and Leo space to process this." "But Jim, this isn't failure. This is breakthrough. Don't let your pain blind you to that." She left, and Jim was alone in his office with his grief and his inadequacy. That night was the longest of Jim's life. Leo kept asking for Mama, and Mrs. Cullen had to gently explain that Adeline had gone home for a little while. Leo's face crumpled, and he retreated back into silence, curling up in his room with his purple sketchbook held against his chest like armor. Jim tried to comfort him, but Leo turned away. Even in breakthrough, Jim was being rejected. He spent the night in his room, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of the past 6 weeks. every time Adeline had challenged him, every small progress Leo had made, every laugh, every smile, every gesture of connection that had happened in her presence. And he realized something that made his stomach turn. He'd been competing with her, jealous of her, resenting the very thing he'd hired her to do because it highlighted everything he wasn't. She was right. He was broken. Not from grief or tragedy, but from his own inability to be vulnerable, to fail gracefully, to accept that love wasn't about control or perfection. By dawn, Jim had made a decision. He got up, showered, dressed in jeans and a t-shirt instead of his usual suit. Then he did something he hadn't done in years. He called his assistant and canceled everything. Every meeting, every call, every obligation. "For how long?" his assistant asked, clearly confused. "Indefinitely," Jim said. "Tell the board I'm taking a personal leave. Tell investors I'm dealing with a family matter. I don't care what you tell them, I'm not available." He hung up before she could ask questions. Then he went to Leo's room and found his son awake, staring at the ceiling with red-rimmed eyes that looked too sad for a 4-year-old. "Hey, buddy," Jim said softly, sitting on the edge of the bed. "I know you're sad. I know you miss Addie. I miss her too." Leo looked at him, surprised. "I made mistakes," Jim continued, his voice rough but honest. "I was so focused on making you like other kids that I forgot you're perfect as you are. And I was so scared of not being enough that I pushed away anyone who got close. Including you. Especially you." Leo's eyes were wide now, listening. "You called Addie Mama," Jim said, and his voice cracked, but he pushed through. "And that hurt me. Not because I'm angry at you, never because of that, but because it showed me how much I've failed to make you feel safe with me. How much I've let my fears get in the way of being your dad." Jim reached out slowly, giving Leo time to pull away if he wanted. But Leo didn't move, so Jim gently touched his son's hand. "I'm going to do better," Jim whispered. "Starting right now, no more hiding in my office, no more pretending I have everything under control. Just me and you, figuring this out together. Then maybe we can convince Addie to come back if she's willing to deal with both of us being a mess." Leo's fingers twitched in Jim's hand, then slowly curled around his father's pinky. It was the first time his son had voluntarily held his hand in years. Jim's tears came again, but this time they felt different. Less like grief and more like release, like something frozen finally beginning to thaw. "I love you so much," Jim said, "even when I don't know how to show it right. Even when I mess everything up. You're the best thing that ever happened to me, Leo. You and your mama, your real mama, Maria, she'd be so proud of you. So proud of the amazing person you are." Leo's grip tightened slightly. They sat there in the early morning light, father and son, connected by the thinnest thread of touch and trust. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the breakthrough Jim had always imagined. But it was real. And maybe that was enough. 3 days passed. Jim spent every moment with Leo, reading, drawing, sitting in silence. Leo didn't speak again, but his eyes held less fear, less worry about disappointing his father. On the 4th day, Jim got in his car and drove across the city to the cemetery where David Morrison was buried. It took him an hour to find the grave. A simple headstone with David's name and dates, and an inscription. He died saving others, as he lived. Jim stood there for a long time, looking at the name of a man he'd never met but whose death he was responsible for. "I'm sorry," Jim said finally, his voice barely audible. "I'm sorry for the culture I created that made cutting corners seem acceptable. I'm sorry your concerns weren't heard. I'm sorry you died trying to fix what my company should have fixed before anyone was at risk." The words felt inadequate. Meaningless. What were words against death? "Your fiancée is helping my son," Jim continued. "She's teaching both of us how to be real people instead of just existing. And I wanted you to know that. Wanted you to know she's still saving people, even after everything your loss did to her." Jim knelt and placed flowers, Purple ones, because Adeline had said it was Leo's favorite color at the base of the headstone. "I can't bring you back," he whispered. "I can't undo the decisions that cost you your life. But I can do better. Be better. Make sure my company never prioritizes profit over people again. It won't fix anything, but it's all I have to offer." He stayed there for another hour, sitting in the grass beside David's grave, feeling the weight of responsibility settle more deeply into his bones. When he finally left, Jim didn't feel absolved. He didn't feel forgiven. But he felt like he'd taken the first step toward becoming someone who deserved both. That evening, Jim stood outside Adeline's apartment with Leo beside him. His son held his hand, tentative but real, and together they knocked. Adeline opened the door, her eyes widening when she saw them. "Jim? Leo? What are you?" "I went to David's grave," Jim said before he could lose his courage. "I know that doesn't fix anything. I know it doesn't bring him back or undo any of the pain. But I needed you to know that I'm acknowledging it, really acknowledging it. What my company did, what I'm responsible for." Adeline's hand went to her throat, her eyes filling with tears. "I'm restructuring everything," Jim continued. "Safety protocols, review processes, whistleblower protections. I'm creating a foundation in David's name to support families affected by corporate negligence. And I'm making sure everyone in my company understands that no profit margin is worth a human life. Jim, I know it's not enough. It'll never be enough. But I'm trying to be better. For Leo, for myself. And because it's what I should have been doing all along, regardless of personal loss or breakthrough." Adeline was crying now, silent tears streaming down her face. Then Leo tugged on Jim's hand and whispered, so softly Jim almost missed it, "Mama, come home." Adeline's sob broke free and she dropped to her knees, pulling Leo into her arms. "Oh, sweetheart, I've missed you so much." "Mama sad?" Leo asked, his small hand patting her cheek. "Yes," Adeline admitted, "but also happy. Very, very happy to see you." She looked up at Jim over Leo's head, and something passed between them. Not forgiveness. That would take time, maybe forever. But understanding. Recognition. The acknowledgement that they were both trying to do better with the broken pieces they'd been left with. "Come home," Jim said. "Please. Not as an employee. Not as someone I'm paying to fix my son, but as someone we both need. Someone who makes us better versions of ourselves." "I don't know if I can," Adeline whispered. "Every time I look at you, I see the company that took everything from me." "I know," Jim said, "and I don't deserve your presence or your forgiveness. But Leo needs you, and I think you need him too. Need both of us, not to replace what you lost, but to build something new from the wreckage." Adeline held Leo tighter, her face buried in his curls. "I'll come back," she said finally, "for him. And we'll figure out the rest as we go. That's all I'm asking." They stood there in her doorway, a broken father, a grieving woman, and a finally speaking child, and none of them knew if this fragile thing between them would hold. But they were willing to try. And sometimes, trying is where all the best love stories begin. Adeline moved back into the mansion on a Sunday, and it felt different this time. Less like an employee returning to work, and more like someone coming home. Even though home was complicated and painful and filled with ghosts, neither she nor Jim knew how to exercise. Leo clung to her from the moment she walked through the door, his small arms wrapped around her leg, his face pressed against her hip. "I'm here," she murmured, running her fingers through his curls. "I'm not leaving again, okay? I promise." "Promise?" Leo whispered, and the word was still new enough to sound uncertain, like he wasn't sure his voice would work properly. "Promise," Adeline confirmed. Jim watched from across the room, and the longing on his face was so naked it hurt to see. He wanted to be the one Leo clung to, the one whose promises mattered most. But he was learning, slowly, painfully, that parenting wasn't about being first or most important. It was about showing up consistently and letting love grow in whatever form it took. That afternoon, something small but significant happened. Jim was reading to Leo, a simple story about trucks and construction, and Leo shifted on the couch until he was pressed against both of them. One small hand on Jim's knee, his head on Adeline's shoulder, creating a bridge between them. Jim's voice caught on the words, emotion overwhelming him, but he kept reading, kept being present, even as tears blurred the pictures on the page. After Leo fell asleep between them, Adeline spoke softly. "He's choosing both of you. You see that, right?" "I see him choosing safety," Jim said, "and you provide that in ways I still don't know how to. You're learning." Adeline adjusted the blanket over Leo's sleeping form. "These past few days, the changes you're making at the company, the time you're spending with him, it matters. He feels it." "Does he?" Jim looked at his sleeping son, so small and peaceful. "Because sometimes I think he just tolerates me while waiting for you." "Children don't tolerate, Jim. They're too honest for that. If Leo sits with you, holds your hand, lets you read to him, that's love. Imperfect, developing love, but real." Jim wanted to believe her. He was trying to believe her. But years of feeling inadequate didn't disappear because of a few good days. The following week brought an unexpected crisis that would test everything they'd built. Jim's company had a quarterly shareholders meeting, unavoidable, essential, the kind of thing a CEO couldn't delegate. He'd been preparing for weeks, but now the idea of leaving Leo and Adeline felt impossible. "I could take Leo with me," Jim said over breakfast. "It's just one day." "We could." "No," Adeline said gently but firmly. "Leo needs stability right now, not disruption. You go. Do what you need to do. We'll be fine." But Jim hesitated. What if Leo regressed without him? What if his son took his absence as abandonment? What if the fragile progress they'd made crumbled while he was in a conference room talking about profit margins? "Jim." Adeline reached across the table and did something surprising. She took his hand. "You can be a father and a CEO. Those things don't have to be mutually exclusive. Leo needs to learn that you leave sometimes, but you always come back. That's important too." Her hand was warm in his, and Jim felt something shift. Not attraction, exactly, but awareness of her as more than Leo's caretaker. As a woman who understood complexity, who saw him not as a billionaire or a villain, but as a person trying to do better. He pulled his hand back quickly, unsettled. "Right. Of course. I'll be back by dinner." But all through the meeting, Jim's mind was elsewhere. He presented quarterly results, fielded questions about the new safety initiatives. Some shareholders grumbled about the costs, but Jim held firm and made decisions that would affect thousands of employees. And the whole time, he thought about Leo, about Adeline, about the strange, complicated family unit they were becoming. He made it home by dinner, as promised. But when he walked through the door, he heard something that stopped him cold. Laughter. Leo's laughter, bright and free. And then, a new voice, a man's voice, deep and friendly, saying, "Again. Do the dinosaur voice again." Jim walked into the living room and found Adeline sitting on the couch next to a man he didn't recognize. The man was handsome in a casual way, with kind eyes and an easy smile. And Leo was between them, giggling as Adeline made exaggerated dinosaur sounds. "Jim!" Adeline stood quickly. "You're home early. This is Kit. He's my friend from before. He stopped by to drop off some books I'd left at his place." Kit stood too, extending a hand. "Nice to meet you, Mr. Morrison. Addie's told me about the amazing work you're doing with Leo." Jim shook the offered hand, his mind racing. Friend from before. The way Kit looked at Adeline, familiar, comfortable, like someone who'd known her in a different life. "Nice to meet you," Jim said, his voice cooler than intended. Leo tugged on Kit's sleeve. "More dinosaur," and Kit laughed and obliged, making Leo dissolve into giggles again. Jealousy, hot, irrational, completely inappropriate, flooded Jim's system. This stranger was in his house, making his son laugh, sitting too close to Adeline. Kit was just leaving. Adeline said, reading something in Jim's expression. Right, Kit? Right. Kit agreed, but he gave Adeline a look that spoke volumes. Concern, question. The kind of look people exchange when they have history, when they know each other's pain. After Kit left, the house felt too quiet. Leo went to wash up for dinner, leaving Jim and Adeline alone in the living room. Who is he? Jim asked, hating how possessive he sounded. A friend, Adeline said carefully. Someone who was there for me after David died. After I lost the baby. He helped me through the worst of it. Just a friend? Adeline's eyes narrowed. That's not your business, Jim. He's in my house with my son. Your son who was happy, Adeline interrupted, her voice sharp. Your son who was laughing and playing and being a normal kid. Isn't that what you wanted? Jim knew she was right. Knew his reaction was unfair, unreasonable. But something about seeing Leo so comfortable with another man, seeing Adeline smile at someone else that way, had triggered something primal in him. You're right, Jim said, forcing himself to breathe. I'm sorry, you're allowed to have friends, a life outside of this house. Thank you for that permission, Adeline said dryly. Very generous of you. The tension between them crackled like electricity. They stood facing each other, and Jim realized how close they were standing. Close enough that he could smell her shampoo, something clean and simple. Close enough to see the pulse in her throat, the rise and fall of her chest. Jim, Adeline said softly, and there was warning in her voice. Don't what? Don't confuse gratitude with something else. Don't let your loneliness make you see things that aren't there. Her words should have stung, but they felt like clarity. Was that what this was? Loneliness? The desperate need for connection after years of isolation? You're right, Jim said, stepping back. I'm sorry. Stop apologizing and start being honest. Adeline crossed her arms. What's really bothering you? That Kit was here, or that Leo responded to him? Both, Jim admitted. Neither. I don't know, seeing him with Leo. It reminded me how easy other people make it look, how natural connection is for everyone except me. It's not easy for everyone, Adeline said. Kit has his own struggles, his own losses. But he's not pretending to have it together. That's the difference. Before Jim could respond, Leo came running back in, freshly washed and ready for dinner. He grabbed both Jim and Adeline's hands, trying to pull them toward the dining room. Hungry, Leo announced. Very hungry. And just like that, the tension broke. Adeline laughed, and Jim felt his own smile tugging at his lips. They let Leo pull them forward, this child who was finally speaking, finally expressing needs and wants. At dinner, Leo chattered in his halting way about his day. Short sentences, simple words, but communication. Real, beautiful communication. Kit funny, Leo said around a mouthful of pasta. Don't talk with your mouth full, Jim said gently, then added. But yes, Kit seemed very funny. Leo nodded enthusiastically. He tell jokes. Mama laugh lots. Jim's chest tightened at the casual, Mama, but he pushed through it. That's good, buddy. Laughter is important. Daddy laugh too? Leo asked, and the word daddy, the first time Leo had ever called him that, made Jim's breath catch. Yeah, Jim managed. Daddy laughs too, sometimes. More laughing, Leo declared. Less sad face. Out of the mouths of babes, Jim thought. His 4-year-old son had just diagnosed his emotional constipation in 3 words. After Leo went to bed, Jim found Adeline in the kitchen again. It had become their space for difficult conversations, this kitchen that was too big and too pristine. He called me Daddy, Jim said, leaning against the counter. I heard. Adeline smiled, genuine warmth in her expression. How did it feel? Terrifying. Amazing. Like I finally earned something I should have had all along. Jim paused. I'm sorry about earlier, about how I reacted to Kit. I need to tell you something, Adeline said, her voice careful. Kit and I, we had a brief thing. About a year after David died, I was trying to move on, trying to feel something other than grief. It didn't work. We stayed friends, but You don't owe me explanations about your past? I know, but I want to be honest. Especially because... She stopped, her hand moving to her stomach in a gesture so brief Jim almost missed it. Because what? Adeline took a deep breath, and Jim saw fear flash across her face. I'm pregnant. The world tilted sideways. Jim gripped the counter, trying to process. Kit? No. It was someone else. Someone I was seeing briefly a few months ago, before I took this job. It didn't work out. He made it clear he didn't want to be a father. So I'm doing this alone. Does Leo know? Not yet. I'm only about 12 weeks along. I wanted to wait, make sure everything was... She trailed off, her hand on her stomach again, protective and scared. Jim's mind raced through implications. Adeline pregnant, raising a child alone, the impossible complexity of their already complicated situation. I'm not asking you for anything, Adeline said quickly. I know this makes everything messier. If you want me to leave, I understand. I can find somewhere else, raise the baby on my own, maybe still visit Leo sometimes. Stop, Jim interrupted. Just stop. He moved closer, not touching but near enough that she had to look at him. You're not leaving, he said firmly. Leo needs you, and... He paused, the words feeling too big for his mouth. And maybe I need you too, both of you, all of you. Adeline's eyes filled with tears. Jim, you don't have to. I'm not offering out of obligation, Jim said. I'm offering because somewhere in the past few weeks you've become family. Not the family I planned or expected, but family nonetheless. So you stay. You and Leo and the baby you're carrying. We figure it out together. Why? Adeline whispered. Why would you do that? Because Leo loves you. Because you've taught me how to be a better person. Because... Jim hesitated, then pushed forward with honesty. Because the idea of you leaving, of this house going back to how it was before you arrived, is unbearable. And I know that's not romantic or grand. I know I'm offering you messiness and complication, but it's real. And maybe that's enough. A tear slipped down Adeline's cheek. I'm scared. Me too, Jim admitted. I'm terrified I'll fail you the way I almost failed Leo. Terrified I'll say the wrong thing or make the wrong choice. But I'm more terrified of not trying. They stood in the kitchen, two broken people trying to build something whole from their scattered pieces. It wasn't a declaration of love. It wasn't a romantic gesture. It was just two humans acknowledging that they were better together than apart. Okay, Adeline said finally. We try. Together. But, Jim, if you hurt Leo, if you go back to being distant or controlling, I won't, Jim promised. I can't promise perfection, but I can promise presence, and effort, and honesty, even when it's hard, Adeline nodded, wiping her eyes. That's all anyone can offer. That night, Jim lay in bed thinking about the impossibility of his life. 6 weeks ago, he'd been alone with a silent son, drowning in his own inadequacy. Now he was... what? Co-parenting with a woman he'd hired? Building a family from grief and guilt and desperate hope? It shouldn't work. Logic said it was doomed. But Leo was speaking. Adeline was staying. And somewhere in the chaos, Jim was learning that the best things in life weren't planned or controlled. They were surrendered to. The next few weeks brought a new rhythm. Jim took more time off work, delegating responsibilities he'd once thought only he could handle. He discovered that the world didn't end when he wasn't micromanaging every detail. The company ran fine. Better than fine, actually, with new leadership stepping up. Adeline's pregnancy progressed. Morning sickness hit hard some days, and Jim found himself learning to make ginger tea and keeping crackers stocked. Leo, once they told him about the baby, became obsessively protective of Adeline's stomach. "Baby in there?" he'd ask repeatedly, pressing his small hand against her abdomen. "Yes, sweetheart, a baby." "My baby?" Leo asked hopefully. "Your baby brother or sister," Adeline confirmed. "You'll be a big brother." Leo's face lit up with pride and excitement. "Teach baby talking. Teach baby purple." And Jim watched his son transform from a silent, isolated child into a chattering, engaged, excited, almost brother. The change was miraculous. One Saturday afternoon, Leo had a preschool performance. Jim had avoided these events before, uncomfortable with the stares and whispers about his silent son. But now Leo was insisting they come. "Mama and Daddy watch," Leo said firmly. "Both. Together." So they went, Jim, Adeline, and Mrs. Cullen, to a small auditorium filled with proud parents and squirming children. Leo's class performed a simple song about seasons, and Leo stood in the front row, his voice small but present, singing along. Jim's chest felt so full it hurt. His son, singing, in public, like it was the most natural thing in the world. Adeline reached over and took Jim's hand, squeezing gently. And Jim squeezed back, not caring what anyone thought, just feeling grateful for this moment, this progress, this impossible gift. After the performance, Leo ran to them, his face glowing with pride. "I sang loud!" "You sang perfectly," Jim said, lifting Leo into his arms. "I'm so proud of you, buddy." "Mama proud too?" Leo asked, looking at Adeline. "So proud," Adeline confirmed, her eyes shining with tears. "The proudest mama in the whole world." And standing there in the crowded auditorium with his son in his arms and Adeline beside him, Jim felt something he hadn't felt in years. Complete. Not perfect, not without complications or pain, but complete, like all the broken pieces were finally starting to fit together into something that resembled wholeness. The weeks turned into months, and autumn painted the mansion's gardens in shades of gold and rust. Adeline's pregnancy became more visible, her body changing in ways that made everything more real. Jim found himself thinking about the future, not with anxiety or need for control, but with cautious hope. But nothing worth having comes without being tested. The test arrived on a Tuesday morning when Adeline came downstairs with red-rimmed eyes and tear-stained cheeks. "I can't do this," she said without preamble. "I need to leave." Jim looked up from helping Leo with breakfast, his heart dropping into his stomach. "What happened?" "This." Adeline gestured around the mansion, at Jim, at herself. "All of this. I'm pregnant with another man's child, living in the house of the man whose company killed my fiancé, playing mother to a child who isn't mine. It's too much. It's too complicated. I need to go before I hurt everyone more than I already have." "You're not hurting anyone," Jim said carefully, aware of Leo watching with worried eyes. "I'm confusing Leo, making him think I'm his mother when I'm not. What happens when the baby comes and I'm divided between two children? What happens when he realizes I have my own family and he's just someone I was hired to help?" "That's not true. Leo, I'm leaving," Adeline interrupted, her voice breaking. "I've already packed. I'm sorry, Jim. I'm so sorry. But I can't keep pretending this is sustainable." "Mama, no!" Leo's voice cut through the tension, loud and desperate. "Mama, stay, please!" Adeline's sob broke free. She knelt in front of Leo, taking his small hands in hers. "Sweetheart, I love you so much. But sometimes love isn't enough. Sometimes people need to leave, even when they don't want to." "Like my first mama?" Leo asked, his voice small. "She left, too." The words hit like bullets. Jim's throat closed, and Adeline pressed her face into Leo's hair, her shoulders shaking. "Your first mama didn't want to leave you," Jim managed to say, kneeling beside them. "She loved you so much. But sometimes bodies get sick, and we can't control that." "Everyone leaves," Leo whispered, and the resignation in his voice was wrong for a 4-year-old. "Everyone always leaves." Jim looked at Adeline, and something passed between them. A recognition. They were about to traumatize this child in the name of protecting themselves from potential future pain. "What if I don't want you to go?" Jim said quietly. Adeline looked up, tears streaming down her face. "Jim, what if I don't want Leo to lose you? What if I don't want to lose you either?" The words felt too big, too honest, too raw. But Jim was done hiding. These past months, they've been the best of my life. Not because everything's perfect, but because it's real. You're real. What we're building together is real. We're building it on grief and guilt. We're building it on honesty and effort and showing up every day. Jim countered. Yes, the foundation is complicated. Yes, there's pain in history we can't erase. But that doesn't make what we have less valuable. It makes it more valuable, because we chose it knowing how hard it would be. Adeline shook her head. You're just trying to keep Leo stable. You don't actually want me. I love you, Jim said, and the admission shocked them both. I don't know when it happened or how, but somewhere between you're challenging me and teaching Leo and showing me how to be better. I fell in love with you, not with gratitude or obligation, but real, messy, complicated love. Adeline stared at him, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly. I love you, Jim repeated, gaining confidence. I love how you don't let me hide behind money or power. I love how you see Leo as perfect exactly as he is. I love your strength and your grief, and the way you make terrible puns and forget to close cabinets. I love that you're carrying a child who isn't mine, but who I already want to protect and cherish because they're part of you. Jim, you can't. I can, I do. He reached out, gently touching her face. And if you don't feel the same, that's okay. You can still stay. We'll figure out boundaries, make it work somehow. But don't leave because you're scared. Don't leave because you think you're not enough. You're everything, Adeline, to Leo and to me. I love Mama, Leo added, his small voice fierce. I love baby. I love you, Daddy. We family. Out of the mouths of babes. Again, Adeline looked between them, Jim with his heart laid bare, Leo with his desperate hope, and something in her broke open. I'm scared, she whispered. Me too, Jim admitted. Every single day. But I'm more scared of living without you than living with you. Does that make sense? No, Adeline said, but she was crying and laughing at the same time. Nothing about this makes sense. I should hate you. I should be running as far as I can. But instead, she trailed off, pressing her hand to her stomach. Instead? Jim prompted gently. Instead, I love you too, Adeline said, and the words sounded like surrender. God help me, I love you. And it's the most terrifying thing I've ever felt. Because I don't know how to trust this. I don't know how to believe it won't all fall apart. We don't know, Jim agreed. Nobody knows. That's what faith is, choosing to believe anyway. They stayed there on the kitchen floor, the three of them tangled together, crying and laughing and holding on like they were each other's lifelines. Because maybe they were. The months that followed weren't easy. Adeline's anxiety came and went in waves. Some days she was confident in their strange little family. Other days she panicked and started packing, convinced she was making a terrible mistake. Jim learned patience, learned to talk her through the fear, to acknowledge it without letting it control their decisions. And slowly, so slowly, Adeline's walls came down. They went to therapy. All of them. Individual sessions and family sessions, working through grief and guilt and the complicated history that bound them together. Leo thrived. His vocabulary expanded daily. He started preschool full-time and made friends, real friends who invited him to birthday parties and playdates. The transformation was nothing short of miraculous. And one evening in late winter, Adeline went into labor. The delivery was long and difficult, and Jim stayed by her side through all of it, holding her hand, breathing with her, being present in ways he'd never been for Maria's delivery. Because he'd been there physically but absent emotionally, too focused on work to really be there. Not this time. This time he was fully present, fully committed, fully terrified, and in love. When the baby finally arrived, a tiny, perfect girl with Adeline's nose and a full head of dark hair, Jim cut the cord with shaking hands. She's beautiful, he whispered. You're both beautiful. Adeline, exhausted and radiant, smiled up at him. We did it. You did it, Jim corrected. I just held your hand. That's all I needed. They named her Sophia Grace, after Adeline's grandmother, and the grace they'd both desperately needed to reach this moment. When they brought Sophia home, Leo was waiting with a purple blanket he'd picked out himself. "For baby sister," he announced proudly. "Purple best color." "It is," Adeline agreed, settling on the couch with Sophia bundled in purple. "You're such a good big brother, Leo." Leo beamed, then very carefully climbed up beside Adeline, leaning against her shoulder to look at his sister. "Love you, Mama," he said softly. "Love you, baby Sophia. Love you, Daddy." Jim stood watching his family, because that's what they were now, officially, undeniably, and felt tears blur his vision. "I love you all," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "So much it scares me." "Scared okay," Leo said wisely. "We together. Together makes brave." 6 months later, on a Sunday afternoon warm with summer promise, Jim and Adeline got married in the mansion's garden. It was a small ceremony. Mrs. Cullen, Kit, a few close friends. Leo stood beside them as ring-bearer, taking his job incredibly seriously. Sophia slept through most of it in Mrs. Cullen's arms, peaceful and oblivious to the significance. "I never thought I'd get this," Adeline said during her vows, her voice thick with emotion. "After David, after the baby I lost, I thought my chance at family was over. But you showed me that family isn't always what we plan. Sometimes it's what we build from broken pieces. Sometimes it's choosing to love even when fear tells us not to. You taught me how to be human again," Jim said, his own voice unsteady. "How to fail and try again. How to be present instead of perfect. You gave me my son back. You gave me hope. You gave me a future I didn't think I deserved." They exchanged rings, simple bands that meant everything. And when the officiant said, "You may kiss your bride," Jim cupped Adeline's face gently and kissed her like she was the answer to every question he'd ever asked. Leo cheered, his voice carrying across the garden. "Mama and Daddy kissed! Yucky!" Everyone laughed, and the moment was perfect in its imperfection. Later, as the sun set and painted the sky in shades of purple, of course it was purple, Jim and Adeline sat on the terrace watching Leo chase fireflies in the garden. Sophia was asleep in Adeline's arms, tiny and peaceful. "Who would have thought?" Adeline murmured. "The silence that broke us would be the love that saved us." Jim pulled her closer, mindful of the baby between them. "Sometimes the universe has a strange sense of poetry. Sometimes delivery women are actually angels in disguise," Adeline teased. "Sometimes billionaire fathers just need someone brave enough to tell them the truth." They sat in comfortable silence, the kind of silence that came from deep understanding, not absence. Leo's laughter carried on the evening breeze, and somewhere in the distance, the city hummed with life and possibility. "Are you happy?" Jim asked softly. Adeline looked at him, at Leo, at Sophia, at the mansion that had once felt like a prison but now felt like home. "Yeah," she said, and her smile was radiant. "Against all odds, despite all logic, I'm happy. We all are." Jim kissed her forehead, breathing in the scent of her hair, the weight of their baby daughter, the sound of their son's joy. This was what healing looked like. Not perfection, not the erasure of pain, but the building of something new on top of the old foundation. Love layered over loss, hope grown in the soil of grief. "Daddy, Mama, look!" Leo called, holding up his hands to show captured fireflies glowing between his fingers. "Magic! Magic!" Adeline agreed, laughing. "Everywhere we look." And as stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Jim Morrison, billionaire, father, husband, imperfect but trying, wrapped his arms around his family and thought about silence. How it had once been his greatest fear, his deepest failure, the wall between him and his son. But now silence was something different. It was comfort. It was peace. It was the space between words where love lived without needing language. Leo spoke now, in full sentences and elaborate stories. But sometimes they still sat together in quiet, just being. And Jim had learned that those silent moments were just as precious as the spoken ones. Because love doesn't always need words. Sometimes it just needs presence. Patience. The willingness to stay even when staying is hard. And sometimes, just sometimes, Miracles arrive disguised as ordinary people doing ordinary jobs, ringing doorbells, and changing lives without even trying. "Come on," Jim said, standing and pulling Adeline to her feet. "Let's go catch fireflies with our son." "Our son," Adeline repeated, and the possessive plural made her smile. "I like the sound of that." "Me too," Jim said. "Me too." They walked into the garden hand in hand, toward Leo and laughter and light, toward the future they'd built from the pieces of their broken pasts, toward love that spoke in 1,000 different languages, including silence. And it was enough, more than enough. It was everything. Sometimes healing doesn't come from wealth or power. It comes from the most unexpected people, the ones who see past your defenses, who demand authenticity, who teach you that love isn't about perfection. It's about presence. It's about showing up imperfect and scared and trying anyway. It's about building family from broken pieces and calling it beautiful, because it is. Jim Morrison started with everything and nothing, billions of dollars but an empty house, a silent son, a heart too afraid to break again, so it had stopped feeling altogether. Adeline arrived with nothing but pain. Grief so deep it had reshaped her entire life, loss that had stolen her future, courage that kept her standing when everything said to fall. Leo Morrison lived in silence, not because he couldn't speak, but because he was waiting for someone to hear him without words first. And together, they built something that shouldn't have worked but did. Because that's what love does. It takes the impossible and makes it inevitable. It takes the broken and makes it whole. Not perfect, never perfect, but whole in the way that matters. So if you're standing in your own silence, your own grief, your own fear that you'll never be enough, remember, Leo. Remember that sometimes speaking comes after being heard. Remember that family isn't always blood. And remember that the greatest love stories are the ones we build from ruins, proving that endings can become beginnings if we're brave enough to try. The Morrison family is still growing, still healing, still figuring it out day by day. But they're doing it together. And in the end, together is all that matters.